Hi everybody, today is March 15th and we are continuing with having the conversation from the scripture reading this week from home. And I hope everybody is doing well, that you've been kind to your neighbor, and that if there are two of something on a shelf that you need for home, that you only take one and leave the other one for someone else, because I hear it's a jungle out there. And we are much better than that. I'm not sure what's driving that kind of mentality, but we're all in this together. And we really have to remember, certainly at a time like this, it is not just about us. It's about everybody. So I know everybody that I'm talking to already knows that. So that's just a bit of the conversation for today. But I really hope everybody's doing well at home. Today we're going to continue with the sermon series called To More. And today it is entitled, You Are Not Your Sin. And I want to, well, first I'll read to you the focus that is for that, okay? Sometimes we feel like what we've done is who we are. When we mess up, when we fall short, when we do wrong things, it isn't who we are. We are not defined by what we've done. We are the children of a loving and a forgiving God. So anything that's said today is within the context of that focus, that no matter what we've done in our life, that we are the child of a loving and a forgiving God. But boy, sometimes it's really, really hard, because once a label gets stuck to us for something we've done, something we've been associated with, it is hard not only for the person to keep telling themselves that doesn't define me, but it's also very difficult when others continue to keep you under that label and never allow you the freedom to move on and become something else. A prime example today comes from the Gospel of John, and it's John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. You're probably familiar with it. It's about the woman that is brought before Jesus, and she has been caught in adultery. And the high priest asked Jesus what they should do with her now that she's been caught. And it's a wonderful passage. And I'm going to read it and then kind of pull it apart just a little bit. So here begins the reading. And here begins John 8, 1 through 11. Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered and taught them. And as he was speaking, the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd, and they said, Jesus, teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. But they remembered, and they kept demanding an answer. So Jesus stood up and said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. And then he stooped down again and he wrote in the dust. When the accusers saw this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. So I just want to go back then and recap it, because this is such a great story. Jesus was returning from the Mount of Olives. He came back and a crowd gathered, And he didn't step up into a pulpit. He just sat down and he began to teach the people who were there in this crowd. And as he was speaking, these priests and Pharisees come charging in, break into what they were doing, and they have this woman who they are more than anxious to put on display because she has been caught in the act of adultery. And more so than bringing the charge against her, they also are trying desperately to get Jesus to say the wrong thing. My first question is, why is the woman hauled in alone when it takes two to commit adultery? But that was the way things were back then, very patriarchal, and the sin would be assigned to the woman only. So here they are wanting their answer and asking, can we stone her to death? Because that's what the law says. So Jesus goes to write in the sand, and whatever he wrote, we'll never know. We're not sure what it is. But we know in their insistence, they wanted him to speak to them and give him some kind of an answer. So he asked them, what do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying what they could use against him. And again, Jesus wrote with his finger in the dust. And then after he wrote, they all backed away one by one. Those of you without sin cast the first stone. So it has to be, I would imagine, or I can imagine, that they're all walking away because maybe Jesus wrote a name in the sand. And when one of those people saw that particular name, they knew, oh yeah, I did do that. And then maybe he wrote a date that meant something to somebody because on that particular day, that individual did something that was really heinous. And he knew he couldn't throw a stone either. And at the end of it, we don't know exactly how many people were lined up waiting to stone this woman for her sin. But they knew that they were guilty of sin, of something just as well. And they all left. And this woman who they brought before a crowd, who they wanted the crowd to hate her and get whooped up into a frenzy just as much as they did, so they could stone her, that they all left, and Jesus simply turns to her and says, go and sin no more. So for us today, 2,000 years later, listening to this story, you have to say, what is it in my own life that maybe trips me up and says, I can't move on past this one thing because I always think it's such a terrible thing that I can't let go of it. But writing in the sand is exactly what Jesus does for all of us. That whatever the sin is, yes, we have to come to terms with it. Yes, we have to deal with it. But the writing in the sand only lasts for as long as the next wave that comes along. And then it is washed out and it is forgotten. And it's such a simple lesson to understand that that is the type of forgiveness we're supposed to give each other. And in thinking about examples of what that looks like, I think back to the story of the Amish people back in 2006. I don't know if you remember the name Charles Roberts, but Charles Roberts walked into a Mennonite schoolhouse and opened fire and shot 10 young girls and killed 5 of them. And the community all came together in this horrible, horrible thing that happened in their community. And days later, as opposed to, and he did go on to kill himself too, is what I want to say. This community very easily could have always referred to the people of Charles Roberts as the family that killed our kids. They could have ostracized them. They could have continually remembered them forever and ever. Like, oh, you know who they are, right? You know what her husband did. But that community came together, and not only did they go to the funeral, but they went to the house and they brought food to the family. And it doesn't mean that their pain was gone. It didn't mean that they could immediately jump from, "You've killed my child," to, "Oh, I forgive you." They're always going to remember, and it's good to remember because it keeps you in a learning mode that says, how do I get out of this when I come back to this point that I always let it define me? And you are not defined by anything that you have done in your past. You wake up each and every day knowing that our God does not put a label on you. Our God does not say, because you did this, you can never become this. Writing in that sand showed exactly how God remembers our sins. That you tell them, you write them out, whatever, and they are gone. But the power and the example of that community, as they work, I am sure all these years later, when their children's birthdays come around, that they're hurt and they're horrified by what happened to their children, but they know that in their hearts, in order for them to live the kind of life that God calls us to, that they have to forgive that person. Because before he did that one heinous act, he was their milkman. He delivered their milk every day to them. So it calls us to remember the whole person and never let that one thing define us. That really is the very short and simple message today. People may want to bring you up and haul you in front of a crowd and say, "Hey, I know what this person did, and I want you to hate them just as much as I do." But it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work at all like that. That we are supposed to, at all times, be the example of the loving and forgiving God that we serve. And all God's people say, amen. I want to read to you, as we close today, a beautiful prayer that was shared this week, and it is called A Prayer in the Time of a Pandemic. So this is the prayer as we close. May we, who are merely inconvenienced, remember those whose lives are at stake. May we who have no risk factors remember those most vulnerable. May we who have the luxury of working from home remember those who must choose between preserving their health and paying their rent. May we who have the flexibility to care for our children when their schools close remember those who have no options. May we who have to cancel our trips remember those who have no safe place to go. May we who are losing our margin money in the tumult of the economic market remember those who have no margin at all. May we who settle in for a quarantine at home remember those who have no home. As fear grips our country, let us choose love. During this time, when we cannot physically wrap our arms around each other, let us find ways to be the loving embrace of God to our neighbors. I wish you all a blessed week, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much. God bless. Bye.